Have you ever met one of those people who just can't be stopped? It's like they're unstoppable.
Yeah, I have.
Me too.
What's their mystique?
Nothing stops these people.
Don't stop.
Welcome to Mission Unstoppable with Coach Frankie Picasso. You're about to meet some of the most amazing people.
Stop. Don't stop.
They've accomplished their goals despite insurmountable odds. They beat adversity, physical hardship, and traumatic events, and emerged triumphantly. They're people just like you and me, and they're winners. Are you unstoppable? Here's Frankie to show you how.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Mission Unstoppable. I am your host, Frankie Picasso, and today we're going on another mission, this time back in time to my favorite era, the 70s. Yeah, the ride might get a bit nostalgic for some, might get bumpy, and we might be jumping back and forth in time, so settle in, sit back, and I can guarantee it's going to be an unforgettable ride. My guest today is Dr. Glenn Berger, author of the extraordinary rock and roll epic, Never Say No to a Rock Star. It's an autobiographical romp through his angst-driven teenage years to now, starting starting in a magical time in history when the best music in the world was being recorded, according to me. Some of it on 52nd Street at A&R Records, where Glen, under the tutelage of the legendary Phil Ramone, rose from tape schlepper to respected recording engineer, and he worked on and with some of the biggest stars of their times, like Mick Jagger, Sinatra, Dylan, Paul Simon, Judy Collins, Phoebe Snow, and Bob Fosse, to mention just a few names you might know. After 20 years in the music business, Glenn became a psychotherapist and currently practices in New York City and around the world via Skype. He's the inventor of a series of psychology iPhone apps called Shrinky, and he blogs about relationships, success, and creativity at his website, www.glennberger, that's two N's with a BERGER.net. And he is also the author of a children's book, Princess Shantuk and the Outside World. Excerpts from his memoirs have now been published in Esquire, Rolling Stone, and SOS magazine. And today you get to hear him here with me on Mission Unstoppable. Welcome, Glenn, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Frankie. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I just have to say, it's a fantastic book. I'm calling everybody, got to read this book. You got to read this book. It's so great. Really well written and engaging. And it's always fun to look at somebody else's life. The book had another title. It had a working title.
Yes.
It was, what was it? The Schlepper and the Star or something like that?
The Schlepper and the Superstar. Yeah.
And so people, it was too Yiddishy, or what was?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if you're a fan of Christopher Guest's movies, but there's one movie about that where it's too Jewish. But yeah, the thought was that first that people wouldn't know what a schlepper was, which I do define in the book. I was my first job at A&R Studios was schlepper. A&R had two studios, one at 52nd Street and 7th Avenue, and one at 48th between 8th and 9th in Manhattan. This was the Broadway district, and it was my job to push a hand truck full of audio tapes from one studio to the other. And the name of that job was schlepper, coming from to schlep, which is to drag stuff. And, New York was dangerous at that time in the 70s. So a trip across Midtown with a hand truck could be a dangerous thing. You never knew when you were going to get mugged or somebody was going to hit you over the head with an axe or something like that. So that's where I got my degree from Screw University in the Don't Screw With Me class.
So you're big, come off with your big self.
Indeed.
Your little big self. Yeah. I love it. I love that voice that you had.
Red-headed kid. Big self, yeah.
I know. I don't know. I mean, when you describe yourself, and you're quite handsome, but you describe yourself in the book, and you have to think of Woody Allen. I mean, there's a little red-headed skinny guy, right? Like
yeah.
With curly hair.
When I was working with Bob Fosse on All That Jazz, which was an incredible experience, one of the most fun parts of that, let me see if I can turn that off. One of the most fun parts of that was going to an early screening of the movie, and I found myself in an elevator with Woody Allen, and actually he looked nothing like me.
No. Was he with a prepubescent?
Exactly. He was wearing a hat over his, so you couldn't really see his face, and he was criticizing the film, which I didn't think was very nice. But
well, it's not fair. There's a lot of criticisms going on in your life during that time, for sure. That's pretty funny. I love it. So you somehow managed to get your way in. Actually, I'm going to back up for a second because I'm going to start at the end of the book. The end of the book, there's almost a throwaway. You're with Milton Brooks, Broadway Max, and you're kvetching, complaining, throwing this line, and he looks at you and says, "Enjoy it, kid. One day it's going to make a great book."
Yeah.
And at the time, you kind of didn't understand it, but you actually dedicated the book to him.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? Of everybody.
Well, the thing is that, of course, the cover of the book had to have the names of the superstars that I worked with: Mick Jagger, Bob Dylan, Frank Sinatra. And certainly those experiences are unforgettable, and I love talking about them. But to me, the real heroes of that time and the real heroes of my book were the people behind the scenes, the great studio musicians. I just did an amazing Studio Cats reunion here in New York a couple of weeks ago, where 40 musicians and singers volunteered to sing and play at this thing. It was a benefit for a charity called Music Cares. We raised a bunch of money for them. These are the people who are egoless, who really devoted their lives to making some of the greatest music of our time, whose names you don't know about.
Yeah.
And Milton Brooks, to me, was the ultimate example of this thing. Max was the most unlikely character that you would ever meet at a hip midtown recording studio. Every day he wore the same shiny black suit with dandruff on his shoulders. He had yellowing teeth and a yellowing shirt, a stained red tie, always carried an umbrella. Max had been born in Minneapolis. And he was supposed to inherit his father's haberdashery store. But as soon as he could get on that Minneapolis to New York train, he left and he was in New York. And that Broadway district was Max's jungle. He just loved that. And every time a new kid would come into the studio like myself, he'd take them under his wing. He turned me on to great literature. He turned me on to wonderful theater. And he was always there for me when things got rough. And so I would go up to him and complain, and he would just laugh and say, "Yeah, so what? So Paul Simon treated you in a horrible way," because he realized that this was our one spin on the turntable. This was our one moment in all of eternity to be at the center of the universe, the New York music business of the 1970s. And he just loved every second of it, the glory, the agony, and the insanity. So, he was really a great mentor and a role model for me. And I didn't really understand his message until all these many years later, now that I'm probably older than he was then, to really appreciate what was going on then. When I was a kid, when we're kids, we don't. You don't know. For granted.
Yeah, absolutely. You take it for granted. I mean, there's a magic line that you pass, and then you turn around, you look back, and you go, "Oh crap! I wish I could do that again." Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Just appreciate it and take it in.
Last week before I started your book, I was driving down the street, and I can't remember if it was the Eagles or some band from the South. I really can't even remember who it was, but it was 70s music, and tears came to my eyes, and it was almost like the beginning of your book where tears came to your eyes, and I thought, God, I hope they play in heaven. It was the weirdest thought that ever came to me. But I thought, then it'll be okay. If they're in heaven, it'll be okay.
Right.
It was like, wow. It's like such a magic time. Crazy.
Yeah, there's some great bands on there. Unfortunately, we've lost so many incredible musicians and artists, and many way too early. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book and have that great reunion is because I wanted to do it before we all passed on. I wanted to celebrate this moment in history. And there was really nobody else who could tell the story, so I had to tell it.
I love it. So how did you get into this business? Now, I know that, since I was 9 years old, I wanted to be on the radio. And I didn't get on the radio until I was like 50. But you were like 17 years old, and somehow a family friend or something got you into A&R. So tell us the story, how it all began.
Yeah, well, it really began when I was about 5 years old or something like that, and I had an older brother, and he brought home this 45 RPM record, and we put it on our little phonograph, and it was "Land of a Thousand Dances" by Wilson Pickett, and I said, I want to make one of those, And actually, many years later, Wilson Pickett recut that song, and I actually got to record that. So I got to fulfill that dream.
Oh, how fun!
Which was really an amazing experience. But in any event, I mentioned to my mom that I wanted to work in a recording studio, and she was kind of a stage door mom. And the next thing I knew, she had gotten me an internship at one of the top jingle house, a place that made advertising music at that time. And it was run by a sort of a musical mod squad. There was this black guy named Bernie Drayton who was amazing, and the owner of the place was Herman Adele. And there was this woman, Susan Hamilton, a pioneer in the business, genius, had incredible ears. She could listen to a 60-piece orchestra and know that the second oboe player was, playing the wrong note in the 42nd measure. She just had those kinds of.
Incredible.
She was a very strong, pioneering woman. There were very few women in the business at that time, and she was a great leader. And she saw something in me. I walked her dog every day. That was my main job, and she got me the internship at A&R Studios. So I was told to go see the studio manager on my first day. And so I walk in very intimidated by the whole thing. And I go into the main office, and the studio manager comes up to me and he sticks his nose in my face. He had a big Italian nose to match my big Jewish one. And he said, 2 rules. Rule number 1, you keep your mouth shut. You got it? Now, I didn't know what to say at that point, right? Then he said, rule number 2, anything that anybody asks, your only answer is yes. Do you have that one? Now at least I knew what to answer, and I said yes. So there were a couple of assistant engineers sitting around the office, and he said, well, go figure out what to do with this kid. So the first thing they did was they took me into the studio at the far end of the hall, a beautiful studio, Studio A1, a legendary room where so many hit records were made. And in the back of that room, there's a smaller room called a vocal booth where you'd put the singer to be able to be separated from the orchestra or the band. And then one of them pulled out a little piece of paper and unfolded it, and another one took a spoon off from around his neck. And they started passing around the spoon and putting it in the white powder on the paper, and then offered me some. And I had just been instructed that no matter what anybody asks, my only answer is yes.
Right.
So the next thing I knew, at 17 years of age, I did cocaine for the first time. So that was the third thing I learned in the studio on the first day. Then
We are going to go to a commercial break very shortly. And what a perfect place to end as you go down the rabbit hole into the world of recorded music. Don't go away. We're coming right back with Dr. Glenn Berger. No more cocaine.
We'll finish that story.
Yeah, we'll finish that story when we come right back.
Stop.
That's right. Don't stop listening. Mission Unstoppable with Coach Frankie Picasso will continue right after these messages.
Stop.
Secret Cuisines and Sacred Rituals is a quest, a place, and a feast. Join host Vilasi Venkatachalam every week to explore myths, mystique, old medicine, and brilliant modern solutions through a dazzling kaleidoscope of cuisines, cultures, and cures. This is the place where tribes gather, strangers and familiars, to be memory keepers and makers of our evolving, enduring, evergreen, spoken legacy of wisdom and ingenuity. In Velasi's words, when we do old things in new ways and new things in old ways, we paint with an inspired palette, weave our own healing traditions, and become our own guru. Velasi is a troubadour of secret cuisines and sacred rituals. She collects stories of wisdom, ingenuity, and grit. She believes wellness and transformation happen when you stand at the threshold of delight and discovery. She displays her hidden penchant for drama when she leads the safari at the supper club. Her favorite pastime is to extol the marvels of cuisines, cultures, and cures. To her audience in workplaces, seminars, and salons, her mantra is, be your own guru. She is a biochemist, botanist, and alchemist who likes to churn delightful, useful things from a brew of art and science, ancient and evolving, old medicine, and new cures. Join Velasi every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, only here on the Woohoo Radio Network.
It's the Fitness Minute with fitness expert Annette Hammond.
Low-fat foods can be healthy or unhealthy, depending on what you choose to eat. Whole foods like vegetables, fruit, beans, rice, and potatoes are all low-fat and good for you. Processed low-fat foods are a different story. Eat this, not that, says that the term low-fat is synonymous with loaded with salt and cheap carbohydrates. Many times when the fat is taken out, it is replaced by unhealthy ingredients that are not good for you. The New England Journal of Medicine found that over a 2-year span, people on low-carb diets lost 62% more body weight than those on low-fat diets. It's always important to keep your fats low while choosing good, healthy foods to eat. For the Fitness Minute, I'm Annette Hammond. If you're a fan of Fitness Minute, like us on Facebook at Fitness Minute with Annette Hammond.
So pump me up.
Yeah.
Pretty apropos, I think. We just did our first hit of cocaine, and welcome to the music biz.
There it is. Sex and roll. So that same day, right after that, I got to hang out at a session with James Brown, and then got to watch Paul Simon record the vocals for "Loves Me Like a Rock," which turned out to be a number 2 hit single with the Dixie Hummingbirds, and that was day number 1 in the studio, and that's how it all got started.
So, there's more than a rumor going around. You've actually said Paul Simon is a real ass. So something in better words. Is it Napoleonic complex? Is it, just that he's such a genius and he doesn't have an emotional state? I mean, you're a doctor now. Look back and what was it? Or is just an ass?
So first of all, I have to say that Paul Simon is an extraordinary artist, and he obviously made amazing contributions to our culture. And there are Paul Simon songs that are eternal, and they're beloved, and so many people love him. And I hate to bring down people's idols. Actually, it wasn't me who said it. I'm just corroborating what other people have said. There was a guy from Los Lobos. I don't think I should say the words that he used on the radio, but So there were lots of folks who said this about Paul, and I do. There is something, a psychological term called cathexis, which is where all of your sort of psychological energy goes. And I think that Paul was so focused on his art that people really faded into the background, and they didn't really have much of an existence. We were all instrumental. I would often feel like a well-trained monkey working with Paul, and I just pushed the buttons for him. But he also had a kind of a a mean streak. I was hanging out with somebody else who'd worked with him, and he had a way of sort of jabbing you, and not, you wouldn't realize it till you woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and would say, "Ouch, that really hurts." So, but the story that and there are many stories that I can't tell because I'm sworn to secrecy about them. But the one that kind of shows just his sort of lack of sensitivity was years later, and at the end of the 70s, when I had already become a senior mixer. I was working with Karen Carpenter, who was doing her solo album at the studio at the time, and my mentor Phil Ramone was producing her, and she was terribly anorexic. She probably weighed 85.
It must have been hard to look at her. It's hard for me to look at her pictures.
It was, and she was clearly, we all knew how much emotional pain she was in, and our assistant would try to get her to just eat a banana or an apple so she could sing. When she opened up her mouth and sang, it was incredible. It was really sang like an angel. She had the most extraordinary voice. But this was the first time that she had been away from her brother Richard. He was actually back in California nursing a Quaalude habit, and she had a whole new production team, Phil, and actually the guys who'd worked on Michael Jackson stuff, a guy named Rod Temperton, who unfortunately died recently, and so here she was in a strange city with a whole new team without Richard. Clearly this was, and she was in terrible emotional state. And Paul came in while we were recording the album, and I don't think Paul knew her that well, and he asked to listen to some tracks. He was always around the studio because he recorded there, and I played him a couple of songs, and when it was done, he said, "Karen, this stuff is awful. This is terrible. You're making a big mistake. You shouldn't be doing this." I could see her shrink before my eyes. Now, maybe he was right musically.
Was he right? Was he right musically?
Some people would say so. Other people would disagree with it. But even if he was right musically, in terms of the humanity of the situation, in terms of a sensitivity to somebody who was clearly in a bad state, there could have been a lot better ways to communicate that message.
Absolutely. I mean, it does set him up to be, an insensitive goon. And I just wonder, though, at his indiscretion, just because he's so like you talk about the 20-hour days, the retakes, the minutia of just that one little note, a half a second, quarter second, whatever, we have to do the whole thing over again. Like that's where his head goes. And so somebody who was like that kind of personality, almost manic really, personality, maybe he doesn't have an emotional state. Maybe in his it's just music. No, like
yeah.
In fairness, I just want to be fair, kind of.
I would say that if something was able to penetrate to him where he actually felt something, it must be really good. I think that was one of the ways he would make really good records, because he was so sort of dead inside that to move him, you knew it really had to be good. And he also did have that ear. He had a vision. So unless something lived up to that vision, it was just rejected. And great for his own art, but not great for the people that were around him.
And it's interesting, like you said in the book, that Phil was really good at picking hits, during his time. And was it when Phoebe Snow came in and did Poetry Man? Did you guys not think that was going to be a hit song?
Not at all. She was an unknown artist. She had very small following. She was not the most attractive person, and she was on Shelter Records, which was a label that was going under. And as you probably know, at that point, to have a hit record, you had to have a lot of money, because you had to do a lot of payola. You had to pay the radio stations money to play your record, and there was no money for that. So I was convinced this record was going right into the $1.99 bin. It was going to go, and nobody was going to hear it. And then it proved that quality really does sometimes cut through. And she just really touched something for a lot of people. And that song Poetry Man, which was so beautifully produced and sung and written, became a magical hit for Phoebe. And if you touch one of those things once in life, you're very fortunate. She really channeled that, and she had an amazing voice. I think Phil must have known, because he took that job on, and I don't think he would have done it if he didn't think that she had that potential. But we never talked about that kind of thing in the studio.
Yeah,
we were so more concerned about doing something of quality that it was more sort of a nerve-wracking thing than a celebratory. Oh, this is going to be a hit. We know this is going to be a hit. It was more like, do you think we should do it one more time?
Yeah. It reminded me kind of Jan Arden when she did it at 17. And Jan tells a story about she went to Los Angeles, and, she could have had a huge career, and his producer said, you're 30 pounds away from being a star.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, you can't talk like that to women. It just hits them, right? Like, it's just like, ah!
Oh yeah, it was a brutal, especially at that. I mean, I think we're seeing a return to that in our current culture, which is really unfortunate. Mm-hmm. But it was it was a tough time. A lot of macho behavior going on, and it wasn't easy for so many artists. And we see that, unfortunately, with somebody like Karen Carpenter or Amy Winehouse or all the many incredible artists who have self-destructed in part because of the pressures of the business and the demands of the people who run it to just keep these people going. Now, Phoebe, she had a child who was severely brain damaged, and she decided to move away from the business to take care of her child. That was more important to her, and I don't think she ever regretted that decision.
Yeah, I don't. It's hard not to. It would be hard to regret it, really, because when you're mom, sometimes that's everything. But it's almost like it makes me think of Cat Stevens. When he gave it all up for. Yeah. When he became Yusuf, and he gave up all that music. And then I guess later on in life, and his father-in-law kind of relented and said, yeah, you can play music. I mean, it was all there. It all came back. He's beautiful. The world really missed out on a lot of music from him. Yeah. It's sad, that somebody would take your talent, because that's everything. And like you said, you only get to do this once, and you gotta ride that train. And you did. Like, you started as that schlepper, and you learned everything. You soaked it all up like the young sponge that you were. Did you know where you were going? Did you know what you really wanted? What was the ultimate for you?
Well, each stage had the next rung on the ladder. So when I was the schlepper, what I wanted to do was be the assistant engineer. That was the next rung up on the ladder. And when I was the schlepper, I had to stay in the tape library, which was in the basement of the building on 52nd Street and 7th Avenue. If you look at the cover of Billy Joel's album 52nd Street, you see what the entrance looked like. It looked like a place where a homeless person would like to take a nap. And to get down to the basement, I had to walk down this slippery, oily staircase that was fetid from the rancid French fry oil from the coffee shop on the corner. And I would just sit in that smelly basement dreaming of taking the freight elevator up the 7 stories to where the studios were. So I would get to the studio before everybody else and follow the assistants around and leave after everybody else and sneak in on the weekends and steal tape to record whoever I could just to get my chops together. And every once in a while, when there was no assistant available, they'd finally let me kind of cover a session. I'd always screw something up. And as I said, the guys were pretty rough. The big engineers were tough, and they would just yell at me and abuse me horribly. Now, Phil Ramone, this guy that we mentioned, he was the R of A&R. He was a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award-winning producer-engineer, most famous for his work with Billy Joel, but worked with Paul Simon, Barbra Streisand, Ray Charles. The last stuff that he did was with Tony Bennett. Legendary guy who also unfortunately died a few years ago.
Yeah.
Now, he was the alpha of the studio, and he had his one hand-picked personal assistant that only he would work with. And if all the other engineers were rough, they were nothing compared to Phil and his reputation, where he was known to eat assistants for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I didn't want to work with him. That was not an aspiration. But because that was too scary, especially since I was always screwing something up. But a day came where I got a call from the studio manager, and he said to me, "It's going to be all right." I said, "Well, what's wrong?" He said, "You have to cover a session with Phil Ramone." I said, "I can't do that. I'm not ready for that." There's nobody else around. I said, "What about his assistant?" He said, "Don't even ask." So I ended up having to do this session with Phil. It was a demo for Lucy Simon, Carly's sister. Carly was there. She was so beautiful. And somehow I was so amped up that I didn't screw one thing up for the entire session. And but the session ended. Everybody was smiling. Phil never yelled at me. I couldn't believe it. I was just so happy it was over. All I wanted to do was go back to my hidey hole in the basement and never leave. And the next day I got a phone call from the studio manager where this was I thought my daily dose of humiliations was about to begin. He says, "Get up here, pal." I go up to the main office.
I got to stop you. You're going to a break. Don't go away. You're going to want to hear the end of this story.
That's right. Don't stop listening. Mission Unstoppable with Coach Frankie Picasso will continue right after these messages.
Stop.
The League of Women Voters reminds you that on Election Day, we are all equal. Please join your friends and neighbors by registering to vote and going to the polls November 8th. Visit www.vote411.org to find out who will be on your ballot and how the voting process works in your community. This election is about our future, and we all need to weigh in.
It's the Fitness Minute with fitness expert Annette Hammond.
Prevention Magazine claims potatoes have been given a bad rap among dieters. They say it's because people tend to consume them in the form of greasy French fries, chips, and buttery mashed potatoes. But potatoes really are a nutritious food when they're prepared the right way. One medium potato has about 150 calories and 5 grams of fiber. It also packs nearly 20% of your daily quota for heart-healthy potassium. So bake, roast, steam, or boil potatoes, and don't lather them up with butter and excessive sour cream or mayonnaise. Skip the fried versions of potato chips and fries. For an even healthier version, choose sweet potatoes that are rich in vitamin A. Not only do they taste delicious, they can also help lower blood pressure naturally. I'm Annette Hammond. If you're a fan of Fitness Minute, like us on Facebook at Fitness Minute with Annette Hammond.
And we're back. Thank you for sticking around. You're listening to Mission Unstoppable Radio. I am your host, Frankie Picasso, and today in the studio with me is Dr. Glenn Berger. He is the author of the wonderful book, Never Say No to a Rock Star. It is an autobiographical, I should say, romp through his life when he was a young lad working at A&R Records under the tutelage of Phil Ramone, and his rise to fame and fortune, as they say. You were working crazy days. You were now about to become Phil Ramone's personal assistant, his assistant engineer.
Yeah.
Now the nerves have to kick in a little bit.
Yeah, so to finish that little piece of the story, so I was called up to the office, and the guys in the office were razzing me. They said, "Oh, you're Phil's boy now." I said, No, I did one session. That's it. I'll never work with him again. And then the studio manager said, "Oh, no, buddy boy." And he called me over to the scheduling book, and Phil's old assistant's name had been erased from all of his sessions, and my name had been written in, and I was going to be working with Paul Simon all day and with this unknown artist named Phoebe Snow all night. I was the luckiest boy in New York. I had become Phil Ramone's personal assistant engineer. And so that next day I showed up at the studio, and we were sitting in the control room. I was sitting in the control room with Phil, and we were looking at the little TV monitor where you could see the front door. And as Paul Simon was walking in, Phil, this giant in the business, this legendary figure, started getting nervous. He started saying, "Okay, here he comes. Get ready." And I thought, oh my God, if Phil is nervous,
yeah.
how should the little assistant feel? So yeah, it was, those were.
Before you went to A&R,
I was nervous.
Glenn, before you went to A&R, who was your musical icon? Like if you could have met anybody at that studio, who would it have been?
Yeah. Well, I think the person that I perhaps regret most not having gotten to work with was John Lennon.
Oh, and yeah.
We are 2 days away from an anniversary of his unfortunate death. And I knew a lot of people that actually did work with John because he worked at the Record Plant, which was our rival studio just a couple of blocks away. And what I hear, sometimes you don't want to meet your idols, as I mentioned.
Yes.
But it's a good thing. But the people that I know that worked with John all only had great things to say about him, and that he was really a terrific guy. So he was probably the number one guy that I regret not having had an opportunity to work with. But I got to work with a lot of other of my idols, and that was good.
That's pretty cool. You in one of the scenes, you were really excited. The thing went off really great, and you jumped on a drum kit. Now I'm a drummer, so that always,
you are.
You went on a drum kit. That's really cool. So, are you a drummer, or was that just like as a great way to let out a whole bunch of energy?
Yeah, it was just I got to when I got to the studio and I got to encounter these extraordinary studio musicians. I realized immediately that I was not a musician. I could sort of bang on almost any instrument, but I was never going to be as extraordinary as these guys were. So I would never call myself a drummer, though I do like to bang on it.
Yeah. Let's talk about Dylan. He was another kind of disappointment to you.
Yeah. So I am the only person alive who witnessed the entire New York sessions for an album that many people consider to be one of the best, if not the best album of all time, which was Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. Mm-hmm. And now we can say, now I can not only say that, but that Dylan is the Nobel Prize winner for literature, which is pretty amazing. So we were Dylan was going to come into the studio on the Jewish New Year to his return to Columbia Records. This was the studio where he recorded his first album, and we were very, very stoked. We were used to working with the greats all the time, but this was different. This was Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And so Dylan was out. I brought him out into the studio, and there I am, just inches from him. There he is in his black vest and his Jufro and his guitar around his shoulders and his harmonica holder around his neck. I can't believe I'm inches from Bob Dylan. And some of the top studio cats were in the studio. Eric Weisberg and the Deliverance Band. There was a movie called Deliverance. They did the soundtrack for that. And these guys were very excited too, because again, this
an icon.
Was different.
Yeah.
And so now, Dylan didn't have a producer or arranger on this thing, so the guys were going to come up with what was called head arrangements. And what that means is that Dylan will play the tune, he'll teach the songs to the musicians, and maybe over the course of a couple of hours, the cats will come up with their own parts, and they'll come up with just the right setting for the song in collaboration with Dylan. So Dylan starts playing the first song, and he runs through it once or twice. The guys are just beginning to get it together, figure out what the chords are and the arrangement are about. And the third time, Dylan just starts playing a different song without telling anybody. The guys make mistakes. They don't expect this. As soon as one of them plays the wrong note, Dylan just waves them off as if he's trying to get rid of an annoying gnat and tells them to stop playing. He runs this song down one or two times, and then again, without saying a word to anybody, he just starts playing a third song. Again, the guys screw up. Before you know it, all the musicians are sitting silently behind their instruments, and the dream of playing on a Bob Dylan album is now the nightmare that they are not going to be playing on the Bob Dylan album. We end up recording the entire album in a day with just the bass player sitting inches from Dylan's fretboard on his guitar trying to figure out what the next chord is he's going to play. He comes in 2 days more and does the album 2 more times. Now, this is completely unlike anything I've ever seen. A guy like Paul Simon could take a year to record an album, and here Dylan does it 3 times in 3 days. Well, but then there are the songs, right? And the songs are extraordinary, and I think he deserved that Nobel Prize for Literature because he really was an incredible songwriter. And I don't think there's a song in his repertoire that is as painful, as emotionally intense as the song "Idiot Wind," which was from that album. And I'm so close to Dylan, I can see the spit coming out of his mouth. I can't believe that I'm getting to witness the creation of this masterpiece. And the song ends with the plaintive moan of his harmonica. And then when it comes to an end, everybody's silent in the control room for a couple of seconds. And then he turns to us in the control room and with this sarcastic snarl says, "Was that sincere enough?" What? Now, as a 17-year-old kid, or 18, 19, however old I was then, rock and roll was my religion.
Yeah.
And the essence of that religion was the truth. And here's one of the gods in the pantheon, and he's totally full of it. The guy kills his studio musicians with the aplomb of a psychopath. He records his album 3 times in 3 days sloppily. And now this? Was it sincere enough? Man, I'm telling you, disillusionment can really mess with a young man's head.
Oh, I bet. I bet. And I think he said in the thing he played open D tuning or something, and so you couldn't even follow him if you wanted to. He really messed with people.
Yes. In fact, when I originally wrote the story and I posted it on my blog, and it kind of went viral, Tony Brown, the bass player, wrote to me, and he said, he was the one who pointed that out. He said, and Dylan had tuned the strings on his guitar in an unconventional way. So the place where he was putting his fingers was not where you normally put them. So Tony really had a hard time figuring out what Dylan was doing.
But that's what these guys are amazing. It's like when I saw the Funk Brothers, the band behind all the Motown guys that never had a name. And you think, oh, they're just genius. They're so amazing. And it's so unfortunate that they're almost forgettable, but they're not, because they're the whole reason that we love that stuff. Yeah. It's like all of these guys that you're talking about. Yeah. They're brilliant, just brilliant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. Now, you were working crazy days. I don't think you saw sunlight, but you were a young man. And
I had a studio tan.
Yeah, driven by food, sex, and rock and roll. Right. Maybe, I don't know which order it went in. But you mentioned a couple of girls in the book. Ivy was one.
Yeah.
What you don't mention, though, is the transition, really, from, being an engineer. And I want to go back. We're going to go back to talking about, the kudo or the big culmination of the engineer job with Fosse and stuff, to becoming a psychotherapist. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when I started, I saw one generation sort of leaving the studio and the next one coming up, and I told myself that I would know when it was the right time to hang up my spikes. And I had done pretty much more than I ever expected to do in the music business, and got to have such extraordinary experiences. The business really changed so dramatically, where by the time I was finishing up, when I was in my mid-30s, it was me and one guy behind a laptop. And the thing that I really loved about the studio was this community of people. And when you talk about listening to those songs on the radio and tearing up, that came from people playing together. And you just can't get that feel any other way. And that was the part that I really loved. And because of technology and budgetary reasons, that just wasn't happening in the same way anymore. So my interest waned, and I'd always had an interest in the world of the mind. But I was at my 37th birthday, actually, and I was complaining. I was moaning and groaning. What should I do with my life? I was feeling lost. I couldn't get out of the music thing, but I didn't know what I should go into. And there was a woman there at this little birthday gathering who had a migraine headache. She was passed out on the table, and she lifted up her head and she said, "Go to Ellis Island." Now, I don't know if you've been to Ellis Island or you know.
Yeah, my grandparents came through there.
Exactly, and so did mine. So Ellis Island is the island in New York where so many immigrants came.
Where was your family from?
They were from my grandfather was from the Russian Polish.
Yeah.
Pale, that.
Me too.
Where the borders would go back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And so I took it as a sign. You understand the story exactly if you had grandparents who came from there. And I got on the boat. It was a beautiful October day. That's when my birthday is. And I imagine that I saw the island of Manhattan as my grandfather did when he came here at 16 years of age in 1906 without a penny in his pocket. And something started to break inside of me. And I got out to the island and I heard folk songs that my mom used to sing to me. And when you go out to the seawall, all the names of the immigrants. Have you been out there?
I haven't been out there. No.
You gotta go.
I got to do that. Yeah.
Because the names of all of the immigrants are etched on that seawall, and you'll find your grandparents' names. And so I found my grandfather's name, or somebody that had the same name that he did. And I said to my ancestor, what should I do with my life? What should I do? And like Jewish grandfathers have been telling their grandchildren since the dawn of time, he said, go back to school. Now, I said, I can't go to school. I don't have the time. I don't have the money. I like fancy suits. I got things to do. I got people to meet. He said, if I came here, across an ocean without a penny in my pocket, what did I do that for? And he said, I knew I was never going to make it. This is all in my mind. I'm hearing this.
Yeah, of course.
I came for the promise of my grandchildren, for you. So don't tell me that you can't find the time and you can't find the money. I couldn't argue with that. Next thing I knew, I was back on the island of Manhattan. That was October. And in January, I was in school studying psychology. And I'm fueled by that energy to this day, 20 years later.
Wow. We're going to go to a commercial break. But when we come back, talking about great suits, I want to talk about Bernie Taupin and the white jacket of Elton John's that he gave you. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Don't stop.
That's right. Don't stop listening. Mission Unstoppable with Coach Frankie Picasso will continue right after these messages.
Stop.
In today's business world, a helping hand or idea that doesn't come with an invoice is a treasured find. And if that happens to you, then you need to pay it forward to keep other entrepreneurs from making mistakes or getting a raw deal. It's called Paying It Forward with Josephine Girassi, Wednesday mornings at 10, 9 a.m. Central. Josephine is going to have the guests describe their accomplishments, the lessons they've learned, both good and bad, and then sharing those pieces of knowledge as we create a movement of paying it forward. For more information about Josephine, her business, and background, you can go to mymomknowsbest.com. Josephine Girassi has always been a problem solver. She saw this need and has turned it into a movement. It's Paying It Forward with tips, tools, and advice and hard lessons learned. These pieces of knowledge can make a huge difference for you, your business, and others. So join us for Paying It Forward with Josephine Girassi, Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m., 9 a.m. Central on TogiNet.com.
This is the TogiNet Radio Network, radio with a cutting edge.
It's words you never heard.
The
Have you seen the video of the little seal that jumped into the back of a boat to escape being eaten by killer whales? A family was whale watching near Vancouver Island, British Columbia, when they noticed a pod of orcas swimming around their boat. All of a sudden, a harbor seal swam up to the stern of their boat and jumped in with the orcas, hot on his tail. When a whale leaps out of the water, exposing most of its body, it's called breaching. There are 32 different species of seals distributed throughout the world and are found from polar to tropical waters. The largest concentrations of seals in the U.S. are in California and New England. Everyone who has seen the video agrees this was one lucky seal. What's another word for the fear of the sea? Thalassophobia.
It's words you never heard.
I'm Carolyn Davidson, and you can have fun challenging your words you never heard vocabulary with my free app, Too Funny for Words.
Here we go.
But here's what we're doing.
And we're back, and welcome to Mission Unstoppable. We're in our last legs of our journey, and we're going to let Dr. Glenn Berger bring us home. But first, I want to hear about that white jacket.
Well, it was actually a white jumpsuit. You know, this was
a jumpsuit. Love it.
Yeah, a jumpsuit. It was
better.
Yeah, I did get to work with Bernie Taupin, who was the lyricist for all of Elton John, many of Elton John's hits, and all of his early hits. And we were working on a demo for an artist that he was producing. It was actually the night of the Academy Awards when Rocky won for Best Picture. Everybody was very excited about that. And as a parting gift for having worked with him, Bernie gave me a white jumpsuit from Elton John's 1974 tour. Which I then wore, I think, probably every day for the next
I love it. 9
months or so until it finally fell apart. And I wish I had that jumpsuit to this day. And it was, it's embarrassing to say that we wore jumpsuits in those 70s.
We did, yeah, leisure suits and jumpsuits. But, okay, there's a couple stories that we have to make sure that we get in. First of all, you had your hands on Bette Midler's boobies.
I did indeed.
Woo.
You're giving away the punchline.
Well, not really, because,
All right, so here's the lead up to that story. So I was shall we say, a cocky little assistant engineer. I don't know what got into me. I had to deliver a tape copy, a cassette. Remember cassettes? I had to deliver a cassette to Bette Midler. I was working with Bette on one of her records, I think the third record. And she lived down in Greenwich Village at the time, the hip neighborhood of New York. And so I called her up to see when I could come deliver the tape. And something possessed me when I made this phone call to ask her if she wanted to go out on a date. And she said, yes. Now, I think she was about 8 or 9 years older than me at the time, but I didn't think about these things. And so I went down to the village and found her apartment in those tangled streets. And she was very charming, and she's very funny, and she's very intelligent. And she said, and we talked about David Bowie, who she had just met, and she thought he was very charming. And we were having a good time. She said, you want to go out to get some dinner? I said, sure. So she took me to a restaurant called Alfredo's. Fettuccine Alfredo was all the rage at that time, which was, an Italian dish that had cheese, and more cheese.
And lots of cream.
And a lot of cream and cheese. And, of course, I walk in the restaurant. It's packed. It's the hip restaurant of the day. And I just get ignored by the maitre d'. But then they see Miss Midler, and the C parts.
Yeah.
Saunters in with those famous breasts, and so we get a table, and I am so far out of my depth, I can barely breathe. I am just following her lead. She says, "Do you want to have some Chablis?" I don't know what that is. I say yes, because I've been instructed. Whatever they
always say yes.
Yes. So I figured out that was white wine. I had to eat an artichoke, which I had no idea how to do. Somehow I survived the meal. She invites me back to her place, and we're drinking a little more wine. We're dancing to some Marvin Gaye. And she says, you want to watch TV? I say, okay. Now, the TV in the New York apartments, the rooms could be quite small, and the TV was in her bedroom, which only had a bed and a TV.
Right.
So the next thing I knew, I found myself laying next to Bette Midler in bed. And I start to think, gee, I wonder what the protocol is here.
Yeah.
How
far can I go?
What does one do? So I thought, well, I have kissed in my life, so I know how to do that. Let's see how that works. And she responded very favorably to that. And so, okay, well, now what do I do now? And then I realized, if anybody is familiar with Bette Midler, the Divine Miss M, she was quite famous for her boobies, as you call them. And I thought, well, I might, let's just see what happens if I touch them. And she didn't seem to be opposed to that either. But then a picture of my mentor, Phil Ramone, came into my head because he always said, don't mess with the artists. So now I had conflicting impulses. Plus, what was should I be a gentleman, or I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Well, I made the foolish decision at that point that the right thing to do was to leave. And let me tell you something, hell hath no wrath like a woman. Bette was pissed. But now I'd already...
They were nice to you. Gosh.
I was, I didn't realize that I was really just the boy toy of the night. I was just the roadie for that 1 minute.
Yeah.
There to fulfill a purpose. But, I thought maybe this was the beginning of a relationship.
And it really seemed like your purpose through all the book. I mean, saw a girl, have cock will follow. So
right. So that, and it was. But once I had committed myself, and I couldn't get out of it, though I regretted it. But the thing is that the thing that I really regret is that we didn't remain friends, because she was a cool person, and
she does seem like a nice person.
And it really makes a better story that I didn't actually follow through on.
Probably, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Judy Collins
yelled at me the next day anyway. I had to tell him what happened, and he
hands off the merchandise. Yeah. I want to make sure that we get it in. Judy Collins wrote the foreword.
Yes.
Lovely lady, lovely singer.
Yeah.
How did you have this special relationship?
Judy, I was so fortunate to work on the Judith album. Send in the Clowns is from that record. Arif Mardin was the producer, who was one of the greatest producers of all time. The last thing that Arif produced was Nora Jones' first album.
I just love her so much.
A phenomenal hit. And he worked with so many great artists, Aretha Franklin, the Bee Gees, the Young Rascals, so many wonderful records. And he produced that record and did a masterful job. And Judy was I was the assistant engineer, and Judy would come into the control room to listen back to a take, and she would turn to me with those beautiful blue eyes that Stephen Stills wrote about in Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, and sensitively say, Glenn, what do you think? And nobody ever asked me what I thought. I was the guy who ordered the sandwiches, but she and it really did a lot to develop my own sense of taste. And to really begin to listen in a particular way, because when she asked the question, I actually had to have an opinion about it. And so she was so generous in that way in terms of including me. She was one of the first people, maybe the first artist, to give me an opportunity to engineer one of her records. I started out by doing a retrospective album of hers, and got to hear all of her music, an album called So Very Early in the Spring. And that was an amazing opportunity to hear all of her great music. And she, unlike some of the artists that I worked with, like Paul, she was so generous of spirit and so kind to all of us in the studio, and had such impeccable taste. I mean, the team that she put together for that record, and the songs that she chose, and just the quality of the musicianship. And she's, if you listen to her records that she's making today, her records are as wonderful today as they've ever been. Her voice sounds better than ever. I really, in fact, recommend that you listen to her latest record, which is an album of duets. That is just, it's just stirring how beautiful and moving that is. So I just feel so and we've always kept in touch, and
oh, that's nice.
So fortunate that she that I was there for that, and that she's been so generous to write the foreword for the book, and she's just a great supportive.
It's great to hear that you could still go and see somebody like her and have a wonderful experience. Just last night, somebody was telling me about they had just seen Dylan and wish they hadn't.
Right. Yeah. She's really kept her voice.
Yeah. That happened to me with Dan Hill. Thank God he had a really great female singer with him, because it would have been very disappointing. It's sad. But, we all grow old. What can we say, right?
Well, but you know what?
Fade.
Some of us prove that you can keep going on and do great work into your latter years. I don't know if you heard the new Rolling Stones record you're playing.
Yeah.
But I think it's fantastic. I think it's great.
Hey, you know what? Let's tell your Jagger story because we're almost out of time. I don't know how much time we have, but we're almost out of time. Let's hear that. But I do want to make sure that 4 minutes, fantastic. Glenn's book is, again, it's called Never Say No to a Rock Star, in the studio with Dylan, Sinatra, Jagger, and more. Dr. Glenn Berger is his name, and you can get this on Amazon, in Barnes & Noble, everywhere books are sold, I would imagine.
Exactly. So when people ask what the most exciting moment I had in the studio, I would have to say it was working with Mick Jagger. In the early 70s, the Stones recorded a couple of concerts in Brussels, and many people will say that was the Stones at their peak. Mick Taylor was still playing guitar with them. Keith hadn't fallen into the worst of his heroin addiction. But Mick didn't think that these recordings were good enough for a live album. And there was a radio show at the time called the King Biscuit Flower Hour that broadcast live performances of the great acts of the day. So Mick came into our studio to supervise a remix of these live tapes for that radio show. And Mick was as charming as Dylan was weird. I mean, he was just so beautiful. And, we would always judge these folks by how they treated the person at the bottom of the totem pole. And he was very, very sweet to me. He called me Ginger because I had long red hair. Come up to me and he'd box with me and tousle my hair, and I would basically die in ascent to Nirvana because I was a big Rolling Stones fan. He's very, very charming. So Saturday morning comes, and I'm the first person in the studio to set up because that was my job. And the next person to arrive was Mick. We have a very terrific conversation, and then he says, well, what's the next song that we're going to be mixing? So I tried to do the hottest mix that I could of the thing that we were going to be doing next, and he said, I really don't like my lead vocal on that thing, so why don't you go set up a microphone like I'd use on stage, a mic called an SM57, out in the studio. I'll hold
2 minutes, Glenn.
And I'm there, and I'm going to re-sing that song. So I set it up, and I went back in the control room, hit the record button, and Mick Jagger sang Honky Tonk Women Just for Me. Woo. That was a peak moment.
Yeah. And then in the book,
and at the end of it, he said, that one's for you, Ginger.
Love that. Love it. That's so great. And then, in the book, you bring in your wife, your now wife. Is it Sharon O'Connor?
Yes.
Berger.
Yes.
And you're sitting in a diner waiting for your son to be born or pick him up, I guess, from the hospital. And Honky Tonk Woman's playing on the radio there for you. So it's a great, it's a wonderful book. I love how it just comes back around, from the early years back to today, back and forth. It's wonderful, and it's so well written, and I just can't even say enough good things about you and your book, and I wish you all the very best. And if you want more Glenn Berger, go to www.glennberger.net. And maybe download Shrinky. That sounds pretty cool. Thank you for being my guest today, Glenn.
Oh, it was
Appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, you're a lot of fun to have, and I'm sure that you're going to be very, very successful, and probably a wonderful shrink, don't you think, Karina? I think so. Listen, we'll be back next week, and that's our last week before holiday break, so make sure you tune in. We want to say goodbye and happy holidays to you. Wherever you are in the world, day or night, thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.
Stop.
When the chips were down, they didn't stop. Stories of people who, when the odds were against them, turned defeat into victory. You've been listening to Mission Unstoppable with Coach Frankie Picasso. See you next time, and always remember...
Don't stop.